Well, welcome to the International Institute of Strategic Studies, particularly welcome to those of you who've not been here before. NATO and the Afghan government are focused on achieving Afghan leadership of security across the country by the end of 2014. That's 25 months away. This requires them to improve security, grow the Afghan forces, develop the capacity of the Afghan state, reduce corruption, and persuade insurgents to lay down their arms. The US surge has ended and NATO troop numbers are reducing. Security transition is continuing, but the threat of so-called insider attacks has greatly increased. Now, it's been a year since the Institute last heard from a British tactical commander returning from Afghanistan, and a lot has happened since then. Brigadier Doug Chalmers is an infantry officer, and he's just brought 12 Mechanised Brigade back from a 6-month tour in Helmand Province. You've seen a snippet of his biography on the invitation to this event. I'd also add that, like me, he has the near unique distinction of having joined the army as a private soldier. The Brigadier will speak for about 30 minutes, after which he will take questions. His talk will be on the record, but the subsequent question and answer session will be off the record. Brigadier Chalmers.
Thank you very much indeed. I notice that there are a few faces I know either from times before or who might have heard my words before, Nick, so I'll try to make sure that I don't over-repeat too much. Today, as mentioned, as the returning Commander Task Force Helmand, what I'm going to try and provide you with is a tactical vignette of how the summer of 2012, or perhaps more importantly 1391, has gone inside central Helmand. I'm very conscious that I am now increasingly out of date at 6 weeks since TOA. Therefore, I spent quite a bit of time yesterday speaking to the current Commander TFH, Bob Bruce, just to make sure that some of the trends and themes that I'm going through today remain constant. And they are. And where there are slight variations, I'm more than happy to go into those probably in questions as we get to them. Now, before we deployed, we came up with a series of objectives. And I'm going to use those objectives really as to structure my talk so we can measure how we progressed from what we expected to do going into theatre, and then how the summer went through and how it ended up towards the end of it. I'm then going to focus on probably the key challenge of our tour, although we probably woke up to it during the tour, and it's become more prevalent in our minds probably on return than it did in country. And that, of course, is the insider threat, or more locally known as green on blue attacks, which I sense we'll probably spend more time on questions going into. And fortunately, a large screen. These are the objectives that we created before we deployed. And we crafted them very much with Commander 3 Commander Brigade, Ed Davis, who was there summer 11, and then with Patrick Saunders, who was our direct predecessors over last winter. As you look through those, I'll give you a couple of sections to have a quick read through. You can see there's lots of words of assist, set, enable, advise, and then shift or convert to security assistance force. I'll just let you scan those quickly to get them into part of it. The reason I highlight those words is this was a very different tour to my previous tours. This is probably a theme I'll come back to again and again. Previously, and this is my 4th trip to central Helmand, I'd been there effectively fighting the counterinsurgency fight and acting as a central pillar. On this tour, we were very much about enabling the Afghans to fight the counterinsurgency fight. We were starting that step away, and that step back has continued on. And hence the importance of this picture. It doesn't necessarily come out very well. This is the sort of central home security show, or start of it, really set up by Ed Davis during 3 Commando Brigade. It was all the 1-star peers who were responsible for security in central Helmand or across Helmand itself. And just to introduce you to a couple of the characters. Colonel Elham, who's the Provincial Chief of Police, General Wahidi, who's the Chief of the NDS, Colonel Saki, who's the Ankot Brigade Commander, and just off screen, which will hurt him dearly, is General Shirin Shah, who's the Commander of the Afghan Brigade that we worked with closely. This very much was now the decision-making body that shaped the direction of the counterinsurgency fight inside the centre of Helmand. I was very clear that I would never chair this meeting. I did a lot of one-on-one KLE before to try and get some of the issues or agendas squared away, but I no longer chaired it, and I would never let my finger touch the map during the early parts of any decision-making process. It might go onto the map to confirm what they decided, but not as part of it. There's a real danger of autosuggestion where they might breathe back to you what you want them to say. And they were a good group of people. They were very capable commanders, significant combat experience. If you looked at General Shirin Shah on the other side of it, a very instinctive, strong tactical commander that understands Afghan counterinsurgency in a way that we simply never will. And I often used to joke that I wasn't quite sure who was the mentor, who was the advisor, because the roles would often switch. I was about his 4th brigade commander, British brigade commander, and in many ways he was mentoring me as I provided some specific areas of advice. But there still was very much a role to get this body of individuals working collaboratively together and dividing their labour to make sure that they worked to leverage the opportunities and powers that they had collectively as a group. And they are in the lead, as I've just talked about, and they do have a plan. And I'll just orientate you to this map very quickly. This here is the city of Lashkargah. This here is the city of Gereshk. This is Highway 1, the ring road that runs around Afghanistan. That's Highway 601, which runs down to Lashkargah. And this is the 61 run that runs up through Sangin, up into Kajaki. And the colours that they came up with were the red are the areas that they feel they must hold. Those are the primary cities and those key arterial routes that must be held on to into the future. The next colour down were then the market towns, or the areas of larger population density, and so you can see it cascading out from there. But they did have an idea, an understanding of what they wanted to hold into the future, and indeed working with that grain and making sure that our auto-suggestion didn't get in the way of their construct, I think was a challenge for us initially. So I'll run through how the summer of 1391 in central Helmand went, and I'll go through against those objectives. If you remember, the first objective was about defeating a sort of spring-summer offensive, which we anticipated the insurgents would run. They did. In 2011, it was given a name, Al-Badr. We were looking for all the indications. Patrick's team saw them first, but we followed it up, and it was called Al-Farouk. It was even published on the internet. There was a whole raft of sort of coordinated instructions issued. And for us in our area, D-Day for Al-Farouk was around the 3rd or 4th of May, we think. They failed on that day, and then they tried about every week consistently for another couple of months throughout the summer. And perhaps more importantly, it failed tactically because we could hear their conversations. The local nationals were almost oblivious to it, and the Afghan security forces felt they had done it, which for me was exactly the sort of outstate that we were after. And it was very much, though, that failure a result of proactive operations. And what this map here that I've put up here is what's called a heat map run by our DSTL operation analysts, who are ruthlessly efficient and do not let me corrupt data at all in any shape, size, or form. And it compares violence from summer 11 to summer 12. And the main story, and I'm going to just reorientate you back again to this sort of Lashkargah, Gereshk, the sort of irrigated area of Nadi Ali and the market towns, and then the routes and the outlying dashed areas. What this shows you is that from the summer of 11, the area of the market towns and running up into Gereshk has cooled in violence significantly, and the violence has been moved to the outside, or been displaced to the outside. Into the Nadi Ali dashed on this area here, which is to the north of a very significant canal, or along what in the upper Gereshk Valley, in between Sangin and Gereshk, and opposite the 611, and then what's a route that runs down of insurgent sort of villages, still quite dominated, as you can see in that area there. The black dots, though, represent proactive operations where we went in to them with our Afghan partners, or enabling our Afghan partners to get ahead of the curve, so to speak, where intelligence brought us up, where we would get at the insurgents before they were able to get their intent, which was to get back into the populated areas. It was violent our summer, and the black dots and the red highlight that. But the key thing is that the violence did not take place in the market towns, the cities, or in the mainly populated areas. And that purpose of that was to allow them to grow in strength as they gained the transfer responsibilities for the cities and market towns, which they have done. The next is Neri Siraj was the objective. It's a much discussed district, still, unfortunately, I think has the title of being the most violent district in Afghanistan, which can be confusing. It's more confusing for us than it is for the Afghans, actually, because the Afghans understand this business about it's where violence is, not the level of violence that really matters. It's a very large district itself, really centered around a city, the city of Gereshk, which sits on the Highway 1, at the intersection of the Helmand River. Historically very important. Indeed, it was the primary major city in Helmand throughout its history, as you can read back over times. But the bulk of the violence now sits mostly in the northern end of the UGV. The areas to the south have very much now been brought, or the violence has been pushed out of them in the areas of Malgir, Parchau, and the area just to the north of Gereshk city itself. But there is still a patch to the north which remains a source of much problem. But if you're in Gereshk city, you are oblivious to that level of violence. And Gereshk city, in our time, we saw 500 new shops, a lot of external investors, and I'm very conscious when I come to my beef and tomatoes bit slightly shortly, but the level of economic growth inside the city did continue through that period of time. Indeed, the transfer plan for it, which we worked up with the Afghans, very much under their feeling of what area could be secured and who would control it, and looked at cascading the responsibility for us to move out. And we moved out of the city centre, less police advisors. We were off the highway, less advisors, and we'd started to hand over, I'd say, the next ring really outside on it. Now, the reason I put this gentleman's face up here, here's Balul Khan. He is the chairman of the district community council. And I'm not sure how many of you understand Afghan sort of local politics in Helmand, but you have an appointed governor. For most of our time, it was Rodi. It's just changed over, actually, last week. And then beneath that, you had an elected council, of which there was a chair which was elected into place. And Balul Khan was the elected chair. And there was a good sort of check and balance then between the district governor and an elected council to sort of balance through, particularly the outer-lying areas. He was extremely outreaching, actually very forward-thinking. Of all the Afghans I've known, his balance of institution and agenda is probably in a really good place. He was genuinely altruistic in some of the things he was trying to achieve. I initially had to enable him to get to do outreach into the outlying areas. By the end of our tour, I'd lost track of his movements because the security bubble that was now controlled and responsible for the Afghans had grown to the size that I no longer needed to enable him. And he was travelling on his own and no longer needing my help. The third task we set ourselves was enabling Afghan consolidation. Under Patrick's time, the transfer, in fact, under Davis's time, the transfer responsibility of Lashkargah, followed by Nadi Ali, going by sub-districts, that plan had started. And our aim was very much to sustain it and keep it going, keep that momentum moving. We shut down about 60% of our bases inside the main market areas and moved ourselves to the fringes. If you go back to that heat map, so the area of blue, I wanted to make sure that our signature, our footprint in the middle was out of there, just to make sure that we weren't actually still part of the structure that was holding stability in the centre, and also reallocating our troops to the other side, which worked. And our physical presence being reduced, I think, is best brought to pay by a couple of small vignettes. In central Nadi Ali, in the centre, there were 5 framework companies there in the summer of 2011. And by the time we handed over, we were down to 1 advisor team enabling company. We had no more any framework rifle platoons holding the security of central Nadi Ali together. That's a significant change over that time. But once we left, did it hold? And I've given you a view of microeconomics already, which I firmly do believe. In fact, I was speaking to Bob Bruce yesterday. You know, my beef and tomatoes analogy, which I know has been talked about before. He's now measuring it in car dealerships. There's for example, 2 new car dealerships that have recently opened up in Nadi Ali, and so that growth of microeconomics continues to lead on. And as we have moved out, that growth gives me the assurance that it is sustainable by Afghans. There's always this worry that they'll become predatory and it'll reverse with our departure back. But our stepping away and seeing that growth continue has given me sort of a degree of cautious optimism in it. I think the level of violence you saw by the blue map is also brought to highlight by, during our tour, we had 3 ISAF direct fire contacts inside Nadi Ali. When I'd been there before as a CO, we'd normally have that done before breakfast. So the level of violence was quite significantly different. The next bit was the Afghan local police. Now, these were a group that we didn't really understand very well when we were, having been there as a brigade previously. They were a new invention. Understanding their local dynamic, and local to an Afghan does not mean local as we would understand it. It's more by kinship, linkages, so there's a degree of responsibility shared with the local community than necessarily having been born within that certain grid square. The more we focused on that, we also focused on their training. But the key thing we did was to try to get them better connected to the Afghan uniformed police and make the district chiefs of police take responsibility for them. Now, we've come a long way on that, but there's still a few yards to go. Pay, fuel, all those niche items which they need to sustain themselves. They understand the responsibility, it just may not yet be in the right priority order, but that has come a long way. And they are effective. These people know what is right and what is wrong in their area. If you view them almost like an armed neighbourhood watch, that genuinely understand who's living in which house, which arguably even in our own societies is less understood, that is a reason why the Taliban react so badly to them on occasions. The next one was about developing sustainable security forces. Because a lot of what we do, of course, we can put the Afghan security forces in place, but if they can't sustain themselves, then obviously it will dwindle over time. And nothing we did on our tour was dramatic. All we saw on our tour was multiple efforts for years of work come together in a way in which leave cycles, pay, and the start of spares to flow down started to work through. This picture here is of in the Lashkar Training Centre, and this is an instructor, MOI posted, so by Kabul up in MOI, posted down to the Lashkar Training Centre. So the instruction is now done by an Afghan posted instructor, not by a Brit who's covering that gap. Now, those of you who have been involved in developing indigenous forces know how much of a big step that is. There's still a language problem, of course, because he happens to be a Dari speaker, whereas most of his audience are Pashto speakers. But the fact is the MOI now starting to sustain their own sort of training. And if NTMA were here, they would talk in terms for their transition, how they are transferring the ownership of the schools across to the MOD and MOI, who they now own the schools rather than the NTMA structure itself. Again, for me, I think fairly significant. Tactically, down at our level, I'll give you just a couple of quick vignettes. Counter-ID remains an essential trade in order to operate inside Helmand. And on our tour, for 2 of the months, Afghan army teams disrupted and destroyed more devices than my own. And on every ANA large op, I never put a ISAF, i.e. counter-ID team, in the ANA ops box. They dealt with all the devices there themselves. D30 artillery, we had two of the large operations. They genuinely fired Illume missions, not the odd Illume round, but Illume missions on their behalf. And anyone that's done any understanding about Illume firing in the past will understand that's a reasonably complex skill set. There's a lot more to be done. It was heavily advised, but it's come a long way. What does that mean? It means that all the work over time to get the skills in place is there. Most of our focus now, from advisors upwards, is to keep those spares running for a start, but focus on leadership. The actual skill, how to get rid of a device or do this, that is there now. Sustaining it, top-up training needs to be done, but leadership training is really where our focus is. The next bit is moving to an SFA task force, security force assistance, the ISAF lexicon of what the force is becoming. We handed over a TFH, I think now, that consists of 2 distinct parts, an advisor group and was effectively a maneuver group that operates in depth of the Afghans, setting the conditions for them really to work. And I'll just flash this up just to talk you through this for a little bit. This was our sort of relatively simple design, for want of a better word, American educators, so I sort of couldn't help sort of drifting into this. Inside the centre of everything we did was OPCALB. That was the Central Helmand Security Shura, Afghan-led, Afghan-driven framework and manoeuvre series of operations. It stands for heart. So the heart of everything we did was OPCALB, which was Afghan-led. But we still ran operations on the outside, which was really aiming at getting at the insurgency to keep the network suppressed in order that we could tip the contest in the favour of the Afghan security forces. So DAS was attacking really insurgency resources, lethal aid, homemade explosive, all that sort of stuff. And Stentike was really focusing on the human capital of the insurgency network, leaders in particular. The key thing to work from this, obviously, as you go over time, The aim is DARS and Stentike shrink and Carl grows to a degree as it gets stronger, because the aim of Stentike and DARS is to give the space for the Afghans to grow. But the key bit out of there, which I've mentioned before, is I'm no longer in charge of the decisive act. I am no longer the central pillar of the Afghan counterinsurgency campaign. Afghans now are very firmly in that. I'll talk a bit now about insider threats. I'm conscious we'll come back to this in question. And this was the greatest challenge we faced. We suffered 3 incidents that left 7 of our soldiers dead. And speaking from the heart, these were definitely the hardest blows to bear. They're the hardest letters to write. They're the hardest elements to explain to our own troops exactly what led behind them. But the reaction of the Afghans at the scene, for example, one shooter instantly killed by Afghans, the first aid provided directly by Afghans, support of my wounded soldiers, and the encouragement of the local commanders to arrest those they had concern over, and then at my level, the belief of shock and real resolve to deal with these acts by my Afghan peers, those at Central Armed Security Shura, very much reassured me that I was looking here at the work of individuals, not institutions. I think the level of this has to be taken into context. I would say every day during our tour, we probably had several thousand TFH soldiers interact with Afghans to great effect. And much of what I've described to you there about was a direct result of empathy and rapport by our soldiers with Afghans on a day-to-day basis. And the insider threat, I think General Allen described it during our tour, I thought very accurately, very effectively, consisting of 2 main parts. Infiltration, that ancient ruse of war, wearing a uniform to get close, to close in the last 100 yards. We never saw that against us, but the AUP saw that against them on a number of occasions. And then green on green or green on blue. And I highlight the green on green as much as green on blue. There are actually more green on green incidents than there are green on blue. And there's a whole raft of triggers for those which are worthy of a doctoral thesis of its own right. There is not one specific trigger act. But what is clear, though, whether it's infiltration, green on green or green on blue, the insurgents exploit them all. And it is increasingly becoming something they're more aware of to make the most of it when it occurs. In terms of us as TFH, it is definitely a risk, and it does add significantly to pressure on a daily basis. There is very little downtime when you're out in the field now, but it is one of the risks, and I think the important thing is to add it into the others. The counter-ID and all the other elements that are running on a day-to-day basis are there as risks to be dealt with. Now, I visited our advisor teams regularly throughout the time and found them all to be very focused, and they very definitely believed in the task that they were doing. Specifically, I went to those teams that had lost soldiers from these incidents just to see where they were, and I always left there actually more reassured than I'd gone, because they understood what they were doing, they saw what they were doing, and the reaction by the Afghans that they knew to them had reassured them that they were still on sort of track. And I did speak to Bob yesterday, because obviously he's sadly suffered a number of these incidents as well. And his advisor teams are in exactly the same place. Our mission is to get the Afghans up and running, to keep the insurgency suppressed. Staying with them is exactly what is required and the right thing to do. And the morale in his advisor teams are the same as what I'd experienced on our tour. But I think enough for me is probably, I'll show you a quick clip here, which I think sort of highlights to what some of those who are on the ground felt, rather than just listening to, if it works.
In Helmand, while the farmers sow corn, the Taliban try to sow the seeds of doubt. A fortnight ago, these soldiers from the 3rd Battalion, the Yorkshire Regiment, lost 2 of their own in a turncoat attack by an Afghan policeman they thought a friend.
Oh yeah.
This is them being welcomed into what is now an Afghan police station. Incredible though it may seem, the response to the murder of their colleagues has been to seek even closer ties with the local police. Commanders think more empathy, more seeing eye to eye will mitigate the risk of further insider attacks.
It seems counterintuitive that you would actually get closer to potential enemy.
It may do to people back home, but I don't see them as potential enemies. They're potential friends, and they are friends. And the closer we are with them, and the closer that we work with them, then the more that they'll give back to us.
I think you put your finger on the key point. We've still got 2 years and we still need to be engaged with them and developing their capacity right through to the end. We don't want to cliff edge this and leave them with the shock.
That sort of gives you our sort of view, but then I always was worried that we might be slightly self-delusional about what we were achieving. And those who know Afghans and worked with them, they are a very easy group of people to become very close friends with, and I think I've left with a very close cohort of friends with them. But there's a danger sometimes of that, of how honest you'll start to be to each other. So I tended to spend quite a lot of time going around sort of the markets, because I found if you spoke to a butcher or a grocer, and I picked those two in particular, he would tell you exactly what was worrying him, what was stressing him on a day-to-day basis, without any polish over the top of it. And we are now quite rare, as in an ISAF, a man dressed in this uniform, quite rare in the markets now, for the reasons I've mentioned before. We've pushed out to the outer side from it. That's what gave me the sense of local confidence, because if everything we do is about the local population, etc., extrapolating it, getting a feel for what the local population think was pretty key. And I picked butchers and grocers primarily because butchers, Afghans, have an incredible capacity to eat meat, and grocers, because of the type of fruits they were doing, the lack of refrigeration, gave me an indication of freedom of movement between the fields and the markets to shift them around. And it's the same with butchers. What type of meat was being sold? And I was particularly looking for cattle over sort of over goats. And there are real microeconomic changes in there, and confidence within it. And some of the conversations I had with some of the butchers in particular were quite far-reaching. I'll give you one sort of vignette where I stopped off in a small market town, which is in between Lashkargah between Nadi Ali and Greshk. And he hadn't really invested in his shop, and I was trying to understand why he hadn't invested in his shop anymore. And he said, well, they're going to blacktop that road. With the way the security is going at the moment, people will travel to the larger markets far quicker. And actually, I'm investing in a shop in Greshk, which is where I'm going to take my work to. And that was him looking forward and having enough confidence that actually that this environment would stay for him to sort of invest into the future. So I took this picture in one of the bazaars of what I thought, that's a fairly decent, healthy-looking butcher shop. And again, tomatoes. I couldn't do so. Thank you for that. This was my 4th time, as I mentioned already, in central Helmand. And I think sometimes the context of what we've achieved there, I think, needs to be brought in mind. This was Nadi Ali in 09, and some people in the audience were with me at the time when we went into Nadi Ali at that stage, straight after Sonchara. I think it's fair to say, when you bring this together, that our purpose initially was to get a grip of the counterinsurgency, or the insurgency that was threatening the governance in that area, and then over time sort of hand it over to the Afghans. Now very firmly in that final stage. And this is a picture of the same street, and you can tell by the structure on the right that it is taken during our tour. The two things I find reassuring about this picture. Firstly is actually the streets. This is a bustling street. It's actually pretty clean. For a regional market town like this, the ditches on the side have been kept clean, and as importantly, these solar lights that are on the side there are still there. The first time I tried solar lights in 2008, they were gone within 24 hours and in people's gardens. But there is a sense of shop owners collaboratively getting together to make this market town work, which I think adds to that bit I've given you on a sense before. Just before I hand over to Ben to run through questions, I would say just in summary, I think Herrick 16 saw the transfer of the market towns and the more densely populated areas to the Afghan security forces. We did fight, but we fought on the fringes to enable the Afghans to take control and gain in confidence, and they have. What I'm going to show you now is a bit of time-lapse photography by the Padre of One Royal Anglian, which just gives you a feel for what Nadi Ali as a market town now looks like, if it works. unrecognisable from when I'd been there before as a CO. And you would have seen the no ISAF vehicles in that picture, and it was a padre that did the photography, so he wasn't being sort of editing it on my behalf. But I would say regionally effective for that region of the world.